administration is committed to fighting the drug epidemic and helping get treatment for those in need, for those who have been so terribly hurt. These reforms will also support our response to the terrible crisis of opioid and drug addiction. Never before has it been like it is now. It is terrible.
Never before has it been like it is now. Yes, President Trump paid less than a minute of lip service to the opioid epidemic during his State of the Union speech. But in that time, his tone was sympathetic, emphasizing the need for treatment, but also the severity of the crisis, which he claimed to be unprecedented. Once again, vindicating those of us in the Black community who have noted the sensitivity applied to the opioid crisis of today versus the exclusively punitive response to the crack epidemic of 30 years ago. An important point, as a multi-billion-dollar collective lawsuit against the pharmaceutical industry made progress in federal court this week. Joining me now is Jay Edelson, an attorney leading hundreds of lawsuits against pharmaceutical manufacturers over the opioid crisis, and Van Newkirk, writer for The Atlantic. Let me go to you first, attorney. You're suing, you're going after the pharmaceutical industry and companies. This is a serious problem, and it also is something that you're trying to get people that have been damaged some kind of just treatment, and not just in areas that have long been ignored. Because my concern here, and I wrote about it this week, is that the people most impacted may not be the people most rewarded.
That's exactly right, Reverend, and thank you so much for having me this morning. The opioid epidemic has really ravished communities throughout the country, and one of the big problems is that it's being seen as mostly a white rural problem and sometimes a white suburban problem, but the facts just don't back that up. The truth is that the African-American community, and really all communities in America, have been affected equally or in certain cases disproportionately with regard to large metropolitan areas. We are actually not directly involved in the federal lawsuit. We're representing a number of cities and counties who are bringing state lawsuits to try to hold Big Pharma accountable. What our lawsuits allege is that this was not an epidemic in the sense that it just happened to America. This was an intentional conduct starting from the mid-90s where Big Pharma decided to lie to the American people to convince them that they were selling a new brand of opioid that was not addictive, and it was exactly the same type. It got America hooked on painkillers and has cost communities literally hundreds of billions of dollars.
But Jay, you would also concede that when it began to spill across, as we would say, across the tracks and affect a lot of white Americans, it started to become more of a crisis, and the reaction was, rather than lock them up, let's heal them. And what your lawsuits are doing in terms of working with cities and states, I'm told, is to make sure that those in all communities are considered in this, and not just the suburban whites, as you referred to.
You're exactly right, Reverend. From a criminal justice point of view, we're seeing such a different reaction, and it is much more empathetic, and we've got to protect the victims, the drug users, as opposed to crack cocaine, where the idea was, let's send everybody to jail for years and years. The problem, though, is from the civil justice point of view, if we have large metropolitan communities buying into that, sometimes they think that they don't want to actually be involved in these lawsuits. And these lawsuits are going to, if they're successful, which I think they're going to be, have the opportunity to bring in huge amounts of money to communities that frankly need it. In the tobacco litigation from the 90s, Big Tobacco is still paying communities that filed suit, even to today. The ones that didn't file suit are left out in the cold.
Jay, you've written about this and studied this disparity. and also the difference in terms of the reaction. I remember in the 80s, they were acting like they didn't even know where the crack was being sold. We started painting crack houses to show them it's sold right here. Every kid on the block knows. And now we have this great empathy. After in the 80s, it was ignored. Then when it got to a certain level, it triggered these mandatory sentences that literally cost a large part of a generation being incarcerated.
That's exactly right. And I actually believe that there is potential criminal conduct here, but the criminal conduct would be on behalf of Big Pharma. In my view, crack, cocaine created a lot of victims. The drug users were major victims of it. Here, opioids, I don't think that there's any reason for us not to feel sympathetic to these people that got hooked on opioids. But we have to understand that, as we alleged in the complaint, we think we'll be able to prove before a jury, this was intentional fraudulent conduct by large pharmaceutical companies that made billions and billions of dollars, and they have to be held accountable.
Van, you've written about this and you've studied this. I had gone to you on this question. What are we looking at here? Why are we looking at a whole generation of young black men just about having to serve mandatory sentences, and now we get all this empathy on opioid use where we really need it? I'm not against it, but it wasn't that way in the 80s, as I said, when we were painting crack houses, when they were acting like they didn't know where it was coming from. You've looked at this, you've studied this, you've written about it.
Yeah, so the empathy is a good thing. It's a good development. It's not quite exactly where we need to be in terms of criminalization of drug policy. I think even now, people, even white folks who are hooked on opioids, they are likely to be criminalized. So the rhetoric hasn't quite matched the policy yet. But you look back over the last 3, now 4 decades, you have whole generations of black folks who are in prison. Their families have been destroyed. Then you have young men and young women who are grown folks who have suffered through generations of dysfunction because they were targeted by drug policies. Their families are broken up. They have people in prison. And so I think if you're looking at a lawsuit now against the pharmaceutical companies, maybe that's an opening to start thinking about looking back. Who else might be liable for really half a century of awful drug policy in this country that has placed black communities, people of color, at a systemic disadvantage? So maybe you can start thinking about, okay, if pharmaceuticals companies are liable, maybe you're talking about government policies past that are liable. So
and Van, as we look at that, also how as these lawsuits are dealt with down through the courts, how we deal with the social setting, whether it was opioid use or in the past crack use, the social structures that we need to build support mechanisms in those communities, and to make sure, as Jay's point, that we in effect deal with the communities that need it the most.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you look at it right now, President Trump, he's had lots of, like you said, sort of compassionate language about drug use, about people who are on opioids, less so about people who are still hooked on crack or cocaine or other things. But all that rhetoric and logic and nice speeches, none of it's been attached to anything, any money. There's been no bills coming out of Congress yet that have substantially increased the drug safety net. And we're also thinking about raiding things like the Public Health Prevention Fund, which
I'm going to have to leave it there, but that is something we're going to continue to focus on this show. Thank you, Jay Edelson and Van Newkirk. And you can read my commentary on the opioid crisis in the black community on NBCNews.com/think. Up next, back to sports and politics, only hours out from the close of a historic season of the NFL. Its players and its fans.